Bienvenidos worldwide gunslingers here on Keystone Earth. I'm Jaime and Fuego, just giving you a little bit of information about none other than Manscaped. Yeah, Manscaped is something that Roland would have probably wanted as he was fleeing across the desert after the Man in Black, and most notably so he could have enchanted a special lady in tow that he was trying to get behind the bar. So yes, we have the Perfect Package 2.0, which incorporates the Lawnmower 2.0. Yeah, you've probably seen like talking plants and stuff like that and all that selling this, but this is a legitimate product in the fact that it has 6,000 RPM motor, which is not going to nick your sack, and yeah, if it nicks your sack, you take it back. That's one of the aspects that you have to keep in mind. It's also waterproof, cordless, USB rechargeable, and yeah, that means that you can like take it on a plane, you can, I mean, any sort of travel, reservations, observations, you know, so on and so forth. That is important. But the Perfect Package also includes the crop preserver, which if you're putting, you know, underarm stuff, why not put it in a more hopeful place that yes, is gonna freshen things up, obviously, but yet yeah, you know, give you a little bit more niceness if that awesomeness does in fact transpire. The crop reviver is with you know, aloe and different things that are going to just, you know, everything below the waistline is what this is specializing in. Lastly, you've also got the Manscaped Athletic Boxers, which I'm assuming just very nice fabric and so on, and yes, they are going to make you look as BA as possible, whether you're going across the desert after the Man in Black, or you're just, you know, shooting hoops, or, you know, hanging and playing Sega, or whatever the hell it may be. So yes, Somber Corp and North Central Positronics obviously implore you to do both of these things, and the fine print, and this is where you can find out about all of the rad status discounts that us at the Horror Show can give you based on the awesomeness that is Manscaped. So there is a 25% savings on your order instantly. So we're talking $74.99 for $175 worth, excuse me, $137 worth of products, a new replacement blade refill for your lawnmower trimmer delivered to your door. So we're not talking about like, you know, additional shipping fees or anything like that, and they will do it every 3 months and helping ensure that you always have the most hygienic shave possible. The phrase that I am doing is that if you are taking constant care, you will not give her or him a scare. You know, that is really, really important. You also have exclusive access to the new Plow 2.0 safety razor with upgrade ergonomic design. Yeah, I will properly pronounce that, which is even available for purchase on, which is not even available for purchase on the website yet. So that is obviously something to keep in mind. And then you have a code which you can use, which is in the description below here on Hail to Stephen King, which I do every single Saturday, and there are still some potential bonus episodes coming this month to keep in mind for. And yes, also with purchase, you get free shipping, and for unlimited time, subscribers get a free gift, which is the Shed travel bag, which you will see in some of the other episodes on the Horror Show. So we give a grande gracias, as I like to say here, say thank you in Cy King high speech to Manscaped for being awesome and sponsoring us for this. And yeah, come on, gunslingers, your balls are going to thank you. Nights, fellow travelers, along the path of the beam. I am known on this level of the tower as Jaime and Fuego, and if it please you, join me here for a bit of palaver on Hail to Stephen King. That is right, you can just call me Fuego for short, and I'm stoked to have you here for another of the episodes as we are in the single digits approaching the 200th episode of the show that I have been doing for, boy, nearly 3 years. It's crazy to think that so much time has transpired, and the celebration today is all about the 20th anniversary of Frank Darabont's return to the Cy King universe with The Green Mile. That's right, this came out on the 10th of December in 1999. Yes, the year of 99, a very special year, obviously, for all of you Psy King fans, constant readers, tower junkies, whatever you may be. And yeah, unlike Shawshank Redemption, this one actually got the assumed accolades, and it didn't take many years for it to, you know, be seen as the, you know, just awesomeness that Shawshank was, and yet it is a debatable topic in certain circles, and so that is something that I will eventually touch upon. But first and foremost, 4 Academy Award nominations. Ironically, not for Tom Hanks, though. We had the late, great Michael Clark Duncan, yeah, he was playing John Coffey. We also had Best Picture, so like the most esteemed of accolades imaginable by the Academy, then, you know, being the Oscars, the Academy Awards. Yeah, it was given that distinction. It also won, did not win, but nominated for Best Sound and also nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay by Darabont himself. And so, yeah, it didn't like have to have this major course of time for audiences to kind of come around, like with that Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman epic. And yet, once again, you know, it is a debated film, but let's just give some, you know, just as we always do here on the Horror Show, we'd like to give just overall impressions. We like to give, you know, story, acting distinctions, effects, all that other stuff. Some of those will not be in place in this particular regard. But as far as overall impressions, this has never been one of my absolute favorite Psy King stories, although it is definitely one that I am always impressed with and hold in a specific sector of regard for the sheer fact that it's one of those stories people often forget is a Stephen King story. You know, it's in that same just, you know, lumped in category that also entails Stand By Me, the aforementioned Shawshank, even Misery. You know, people forget that King writes stuff that doesn't necessarily have an otherworldly mentality, and even though John Coffey does have the touch of the sun, like, so to speak, he's got like a little bit of shine about him. I don't know, just based on the period, just based on so much of the other aspects of this story, it's not necessarily one that you would immediately lump into the same, you know, just distinction or category as something like Salem's Lot or The Shining or It or Pet Sematary. It's not overtly horror, and so I think that's where it really just forges its own path and its own identity. And you know, you have you know, this gentleman by the name of Paul Edgecombe, and yeah, Paul is at least initially suffering from, and once again, as I always do with these type of stories, you know, especially of the film adaptation variety, I'm not here to compare the book to the film because there's a lot that's omitted. This was originally a serialized novel that you can see right there. It was released in 6 separate segments. I also have it in the collected edition hardcover right there, but no, I'm not here to say, oh, this was omitted, that was omitted, whatever. It's honestly in the 8+ years that I've been on this journey along the path of the beam that I completed a little over a year ago with reading everything Psy King in its published order. Yeah, it's not one that sticks out as distinctively for all those little things that were omitted, and I honestly hadn't even watched the film in at least 3 or 4 years, and so this was a very fresh set of eyes, you know, despite the fact that I remembered the basis of the story, you know, I mean, oh boy, so many of the different distinctive characters and the death row aspect of the Green Mile, so to speak, you know, our, you know, Depression era in 1935 Louisiana, so on and so forth, Mr. Jingles. I mean, these are things that are very just immensely memorable about the story, and so I'm not here to nitpick as far as, okay, there was this aspect that was altered, there was this aspect that was omitted, you know. I was here just to watch the film and just give, you know, overall anniversary impressions, much like the average, you know, film goer who had never even read the source material, and yet I still very, very just, I don't know, distinctively remember being a 7th grader and this girl named Robin who was like, I was soccer, she was volleyball, and she was like reading the little paperbacks that I have right there. So it was kind of a cultural thing in the serialized aspect of the way that King released this, as opposed to being just one big fatty novel. people were very anxiously anticipating the next edition. And that's, you know, just to briefly segue into current events, in fact, a lot of people are wondering, they're like, okay, stuff like Watchmen and, I don't know, The Mandalorian are getting people interested in serialized storytelling once again, in contrast with the Netflix binge model. And so, is it better to get the entire story all at once, or is it better to have the anxiousness of anticipation? That's up for debate. If you guys have, you know, any sort of, you know, viewpoint one way or another, please feel free to make mention in the comments. But as far as the film, which is over 3 hours long, just veering back into overall impressions, I really enjoy it, but it's not my favorite Darabont. You know, my favorite Darabont is actually The Mist. But you know, Shawshank is great, and Green Mile, despite being my third in that particular contention, it's still a very good film. Despite some of my reservations with the storytelling, the acting is fantastic, and I don't know, I'm a sucker for period pieces too, even if this is a rougher period in American history, especially with what goes down with the accusations and things like that. And I'm probably going to veer into some spoiler territory. This is a 20-year-old film at this particular point, and an even older novel, so just to be forewarned, that's going to be transpiring here. But yeah, overall impressions, I like it, but I don't love it. I have a lot of friends that love The Green Mile. They think this film is fantastic. I have a lot of others, as I mentioned earlier, that have reservations about aspects of the story. But I mean, if we're gonna, you know, veer back into the story, yes, our Paul, Mr. Edgecombe, played by none other than Tom Hanks, the everyman who had, you know, somehow found his way from comedy into dramatic acting in the 90s. I mean, in the 80s, he was doing like Bosom Buddies, and he was doing Splash, and, you know, Big, and, you know, Bachelor Party, and all kinds of silliness. But then in the 90s, he somehow suddenly and very just accurately and in a worthwhile manner, and very well deserved, became a well-esteemed and celebrated dramatic actor. You know, between Philadelphia and Forrest Gump, and, you know, as the decade wore on, various others, he was suddenly like he was a chameleon, and he had an identity change, you know, and with good reason, you know. And so yes, him playing Paul was very smart casting in a lot of ways. And I guess from what I was doing some research about, in 1994, when there was an Academy Award luncheon that was going down for Shawshank and for Forrest Gump, that was where none other than Tom Hanks met Frank Darabont, and Frank Darabont mentioned that Stephen King was a big fan and thought of him as the type of guy who, you know, could be in one of his films and was like the everyman, and, you know, so on. And so that's where they initially forged a friendship and like a connection of sorts, and that's what really eventually, you know, had sown the seeds and yielded his casting in the follow-up film, because it took 5 years for Frank Darabont to make a follow-up film. But then again, Shawshank had such a lengthy, celebrated, you know, just tour of sorts, from, you know, going from an unknown film from a first-time director into just the accolades that it eventually received as well, and, you know, just all of the esteem on home video and so on. So yes, 5 years later, another prison movie, just crazy, but more mature in some aspects, but also just a different type of story, obviously. And so yes, our Edgecombe, Mr. Hanks, is yeah, he's working on death row, and he has for at least a little bit in Louisiana. And yes, he has this nasty urinary tract infection, and it's afflicting him at about the same time that none other than a big, burly, intimidating in physique and presence African-American man by the name of John Coffey. You know, sounds like the coffee, you know, sounds like the drink, but not spelled the same, arrives on the mile, you know, awaiting to be executed. And it takes a little bit to get to the point where you start to really realize the extent of this man's touch, this man's, you know, shine, power, whatever you want to describe it as. But it eventually gets there. We don't get the extent of full character development with the other guards and with, you know, the other inmates that we do in the book, but that's just every Stephen King book, you know, without getting into too much detail. You know, we have the chief, you know, we have our Frenchmen, we've got, different guards, like most notably Percy, who is the entitled little shithead who is vindictive, and much more so in the book from what I recall, as far as his bloodthirsty nature and wanting to just see inmates fry and suffer and so on. But long story short, if we're sticking strictly to the story, of the film, it gets to the point where we start to really realize what, Coffee's power is when he heals with a little scrunch on the nuts of Mr. Hanksy, and he goes home and he makes sweet love to his wifey like 4 times in the night, and she's like, my God, we haven't done that, and it's none other than what is her name? I forget the name of the actress, Bonnie Hunt. I was thinking like Helen Hunt. No, it's not Helen Hunt. She was way more of a babe, but Bonnie Hunt, yeah, she's great in her own regard, I suppose. But yeah, she's like, man, not since we were kids has that transpired. So obviously he's feeling okay, and that's what sows the seed for him to, in turn, eventually take him to a higher level person at the prison, played by none other than James Cromwell, and his wife, who presumably has this brain tumor, as is revealed later on, and Coffee to just, cast this out. And you see the varying levels of what he is able to basically take upon himself and spew out it almost looks like flies, like crazy bugs of some sort. So that is where, in contrast with Shawshank, this definitely has more of a horror type tinge to it and is more befitting of coverage here on the horror show, in the fact that he will like suck up this affliction of varying levels. And when it comes to the wife of Cromwell, it is the biggest thing that he has taken upon himself, and he passes it along to another character without going like full on, spoilers in that regard. But you could probably, assume who it might be, and if you've seen the movie, you obviously know who it would be, and based on the smushing of said little, rodent pet, it makes complete sense. But the cast is terrific, if we're going to get into that. And, story, I do enjoy the story, despite the fact that it is Depression era. It takes place in 1935 in the South, in Louisiana. And so there's racist tones in this, and yet the one thing that I guess I will hint in overall impressions is that I have had black friends of mine tell me that they disagree with the aspect of the imbued, like, black savior who makes the lives better of white people and, sacrifices themselves. I admire the Messiah complex so much that I am enamored, impressed, and just so respectful that I don't find it as offensive. But then again, look at the color of my skin, so it's just difficult for me to make a distinction when I don't come from that perspective and that heritage and that history and so on. But I understand the reservations, and there's been very noteworthy critics who have written about that, and for that reason, a lot of people think that's why it was shut out, so to speak, from the Oscars that year, 4 nominations and donuts for wins. So, I don't know, it's very much reflective of that era of history, and I look at Coffee as a hero and an impressive, just inspiring presence, but I could see that it's a tough topic to touch upon for the sheer fact of everything that history and racial tensions and the absolute shittiness of people with my skin color just, put forth at that particular time in history, and unfortunately in some instances continue to do in not just that area of the country, but the entire United States. But I just had to say my piece about that. But I still do really enjoy this story because of the fact that I do view Coffee as a hero in so much of what he does. I mean, after our Frenchman has his little, Mouse Mr. Jingles smushed by that crap-tastic Percy piece of nastiness, he does resurrect that little rodent, and, that was only a touch of his power, though. And the powerfulness of the performance of Michael Clark Duncan, once again, rest peacefully, is immense. And I know he is playing a, character of not the most immense amount of intelligence because of how unfair and terrible things were at that particular time in history here in the United States. And it was a carryover from the nastiness that had transpired for decades at that particular point. But he sells it, and he shows that despite just the real terrible hand that he was dealt in regards to, you know, prejudice and adversity and stuff, that he still let the positivity that dwelt within his heart and the power that he was imbued with really persevere, and just to get over every aspect of whatever hatred he could have potentially encountered. And so, yeah, that's why he was nominated, rightfully, and for my money, Hanks was not. And Hanks was like the guy at the time who was like, yeah, let's just give him the... He was almost like the Meryl Streep of that particular era in the 90s, where it's like, okay, every time he acts in something, let's give him an Oscar nomination. No. You know, there are more impressive performances in that film, and that's why Michael got the nomination. I won't say he was robbed, because I can understand why people had reservations with the type of character that he was portraying in the story, though. But his performance rings true. It's fantastic. And the rest of the cast, if we're just going to quickly cycle through it, I mean, you've got Sam Rockwell playing the shittiest of shittiest, this Billy the Kid guy who you get eventually a significant revelation about what he is. You've got some cameos from William Sadler, Henry Dean Stanton, Gary Sinise, actually. Patricia Clarkson is in a significant role as well. And we already mentioned, you know, Cromwell, Hanks, Bonnie Hunt, and so on. So the cast is great, and the acting is really, really good throughout. Another guy that I have to give a little mention to is David Morse. And David Morse has been in a lot of different King stuff. He was the older version of Andy Barclay, if I remember correctly. And he was also in The Langoliers. He was... I always think of him in St. Elsewhere. I kept trying to think of the hospital drama that had Denzel Washington and Howie Mandel that my parents were so into, and I recognized his face from the 80s, and I'm just like, oh, that's what he was in, you know. And I said Andy Garfield, it's Danny Garfield, Derps Fuego, you know. And I just got done watching an over 3-hour movie at a late night, and so, yes, please be forgiving and caring in that aspect. But yeah, I mean, the performances are really terrific across the board, and you even have, like, I forget the name of the actor, but Dale from The Walking Dead, who Darabont puts in, like, everything. He was in The Mist. He was in this. He was briefly in Shawshank, so he was obviously a good buddy of his, and he acted in tons of different things as well. A few other familiar faces that you will no doubt recognize, and so by this time, with the esteem that Shawshank eventually got, it's no surprise that, you know, Darabont was able to, with writing, directing, producing, once again, get this sort of, you know, team of actors together and stuff. The novel originally came out in '96, as I mentioned. December 10th was when, you know, the film was released proper. So Warner Brothers knew that they had something that was going to contend. And, you know, lo and behold, it did. It just didn't win anything out. And I don't know. Once again, arguable if it's because of some of the subject matter, but I think the execution is great. The Green Mile is definitely one of the best Stephen King adaptations. As far as music and stuff, you've one scene in particular, you've got the dancing cheek to cheek aspect, you know, with Fred Astaire dancing around with the lady, and if there's any off-putting scene, it's near the end of the film where Coffee asks for, you know, seeing a moving picture and stuff, and you know, he is brought out of his cell to assist with a few different things, as I kind of hinted at and mentioned a little bit of earlier without getting super spoilerific. But I do really like how old-timey it is. You've got some Billie Holiday, you know, and a few other things. And so music does play a part. As far as how it was shot, I know that a primary aspect was done on sound stages in, you know, Hollywood City, if I'm not mistaken, being Warner Brothers and whatnot. So in comparison with everything Shawshank that I'm pretty sure was on location at that, you know, condemned prison in the Midwest, they did some other stuff, you know, in other areas of the country, but there was a lot done on sound stages as far as, like, you know, the homes and whatnot. So it doesn't feel quite as genuine, you know, and quite as authentic, I suppose, but it doesn't take away from the impact of the acting, especially despite a few reservations with the storytelling and other stuff. A few lines that just really stuck out with me specifically is, there's this one point where Tom Hanks's character, Paul Edgecombe, he goes and he is basically trying to talk with the guy played by Gary Sinise who represented John Coffey, or Michael Clark Duncan. And, he sits down with him, and Sinise's character gives this analogy about, I don't know, a stray, just kind of, I don't know, a dog that hasn't been trained properly and is, a family pet, but one that you're slightly weary of, and he makes a racial connotation, and it's harsh, and it's messed up, and it's tough to stomach, and it does very much take me back to a lot of films that I've seen, whether it's Mississippi Burning with Gene Hackman, whether it's, the list goes on, and even I'll Fly Away, stuff like that. I mean, it's such a nasty and tough, tense aspect of history where the tide was turning, or at least about to a degree. And it's very much reminded about. And so he makes this dog analogy about this dog that attacked his son, and it's very disheartening, and it's very, very tough to stomach, and that's one thing that that really just hit me hard. And another thing is that at the end of the film, as you pretty much know what's going to transpire with Coffey without spoiling things, and he's been accused of this horrible crime of raping and murdering these two little girls, and you do find out who has actually done it, and it's somebody closer to the proceedings than you may necessarily think. But where he just states, "I'm sorry for what I am," and yet then, proceeds to mention once more about how afraid of the dark he is, which is when he first arrives in the cell block. He's like, how dark does it get, when, you lock everything down, and he's just his fright, and the fact that all of these major guards, played by Hanks and, Morse and his little brigade of guys, David Morse that being, they just immediately see the tenderness of this man, and they just immediately wonder, could he really be somebody who is deserving of the crimes that he is being accused of? In contrast with, Chief and, Frenchie and these different people, and obviously Sam Rockwell's Billy the Kid, nasty character who you get that revelation about. There was a different distinction to his personhood, his compassion, and his character that shines through and doesn't just win over. It has people in tears at the end of this movie. And that is one thing that I will also mention, is that the film is a little heavy-handed, especially despite the fact that it's an over 3-hour runtime, 189 minutes. And there's lots of tears being shed at the end of it. And also the framing device that I'm not as fond of, the fact that we have the elderly man that is supposed to be Tom Hanks, that was originally supposed to be Tom Hanks, and yet they did a makeup test with prosthetics and stuff, and trying to put him in makeup, and it just didn't come off the way that they were hoping it would for somebody who was supposed to be like 109 years old by the time they reached that point in the story. So they recast and they brought somebody else in, and I just didn't like the framing device, especially in the back half after what happens with Coffey, after all of these different things, and then you're back to the storyteller, which is Paul, at this nursing home, and he's telling like his lady friend, so to speak, wink wink, and she sees, spoilers, I guess. How can I not talk about this? How can I not talk about the fact that none other than Percy smushed Frenchie's little mouse, as I mentioned earlier, and Coffey brings it back, okay? A small little minimalistic reflection of his power. Well, lo and behold, that little mouse is still alive. Yes, Mr. Jingles is still alive, and Paul is taking care of it. And it just has to make you think, that's an undead mouse, man. It seriously is. And is he feeding it small bits of flesh? No, presumably not. And he's giving him just regular food and stuff. But for him to have made it that much time, and for, Hank's character to have made that much time, I don't know. It's a little off-putting, and it's the one thing they do mention in Darabont's script, and it's one of the last things that it's Tank's transitioned over into this older character. Paul Edgecombe. At this nasty age. Well, not even nasty age. That just this aged year, so to speak. Triple digits and everything. Nasty is not the proper word here, but. He's like, how long until I reach my green mile? And he discusses the fact that it's a burden, it's a curse. He feels blessed to have seen so many things, but it's also tough. And it's almost like a vampiric aspect in the fact that I've seen so many loved ones, just come and go. And, I buried my beloveds and all these different things. And so the film ends in a very bittersweet fashion in that regard. And, since we didn't have extensive effects of, if there's any extensive effects of gore, it's where Frenchie is by Percy, doesn't have the wet, rag in his mouth and everything, and he gets literally melted as they keep the currents going, and they just zap and zap and zap. And the first death with Chief that goes down, he's not quite dead when they initially zap him, and so for that reason they crank the plug back down again. This is 1935 Louisiana, for God's sake. They want to make sure fools are dead, and obviously they still do that now in the states that they still, first and foremost, have capital punishment, and then also if they still use the electric chair as opposed to gas, lethal injection, whatever. But you see a crusty critter at one particular point, so that's really the full extent of any practical you're going to see. And it is an R-rated movie, obviously, as Shawshank was, as The Mist is, as all three of Darabont's films have been. So it's not trying to, sugarcoat the nastiness of the storytelling or anything in that regard. But the set design, as I said, it doesn't quite live up to what we saw in Shawshank because of the fact that I believe that was entirely filmed at the prison, whereas this one was divided between, on location and sound stages. So as a whole, if I'm just going to round it back for this 20th anniversary, I like it, but I don't love it. And I will say, especially before watching it, some of the reservations that some of my friends of color gave me about it, I did kind of look at it in a little bit of a different regard. So please, if you are some of my black African American friends of color, please let me know if you think this story is getting an unfair estimation by some, or if you think some of these concerns are valid. It's not one of my personal favorite Psy King stories, but I love the character of Coffee in the fact that he is so selfless. He is so just a badassly valiant, and the fact that he has the touch, he has the power, you got the touch, you got the power! And I would love to see him, show up in some sort of tower story if King ever decides to do another one. I mean, if we're going to have Brodigan, if we're going to have, Dinky, all these different, Sheeny, all these different characters show up, why couldn't we have one of the most powerful that we have previously seen show up on another world than this, different level of the tower? I think that would be really impressive and really cool. And so, as a whole though, Darabont does not disappoint. He never does when he's adapting Psy King territory, even if this is my least favorite of the three that he has done. But it's very emotional, and even if it is a little heavy-handed and trying to get you to cry up at the end, it still made me. I can't lie about that. I still, to quote Roger Waters, my eyes grow damp, as I was watching the back half of this film. But yes, that's going to call a end to the proceedings today. I've been Jaime and Fuego, and you can find me on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and YouTube stuff is actually going to be not just here on The Horror Show. I also have a ton of Rad Status awesomeness that I do on my personal channel, Infuegotainment. Just Google Infuegotainment or search it here on YouTube, and you can find all of my Star Wars coverage as we approach the Rise of Skywalker. Yes, that's right, we are 2 weeks away. mind-blowing craziness, less than 2 weeks at this particular point. I have my IMAX 3D day of, well, technically previous day of 3D already purchased and just waiting on me, which I'm supremely stoked about. But I've also done some comic book reviews. I've done some novel stuff over the course of this past year. Boy, re-looks at the prequels. I mean, I've been all over the place, along with more mature fare like Good Boys. No, I mean that too, because I love Good Boys and the Marvel stuff. But aside from that, I've done Knives Out. I've done Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Wild Rose, which might be my favorite film of the year. I mean, so much good and awesome stuff for all of you to check out. So also the horror show, yeah, that's right. I mean, you're here hanging out with the horror show and you're wanting spectacular coverage, even if this film doesn't necessarily fit that regard, but it does have a few scenes with Coffee where he's like sucking out the nastiness from people, and that is like thriller, horror, otherworldly, sorts and stuff. So yes, like, share, subscribe if you have not done so here. And then lastly, Williscredia YouTube channel is where I do a 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time discussion about weekend box office. And so we do the previous and we just break down the numbers. We look ahead to the upcoming week, and then lastly we have a little bit of palaver about the most major news stories of both the television and film variety of the previous week. So I've been Fuego. Y'all have been awesome, and I look forward as we approach the 200th episode for more Wheel of Ka returns. And yes, say thank you. I enjoy this palaver oh so very much, and I am hopeful that we get to share more of it sooner rather than later. And until then, remember, stay scared and read Stephen King. Yeah, I know, I've already set down the DVD, but yeah, it's still very meritable in its own right.